There's a moment, and if you've ever stood in the observation gallery of the Galactic Accord Council chamber, you know exactly the moment I mean, where the whole thing just stops making sense. Not in a bad way, not at first. It's more like your brain catches on something it wasn't expecting, like you're walking down a familiar hallway and suddenly one tile is a different color. Small, wrong, impossible to ignore once you've seen it. I was 32 years old the first time I attended the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Accord. I was there as a junior diplomatic aide to Ambassador Selvori of the Tharan Collective, a tall, four-armed species whose bioluminescent markings pulse slow amber when they're calm and sharp crimson when they're irritated. I spent 3 weeks studying bioluminescent diplomacy, just so I could read a room without getting caught off guard. I thought I was prepared. I was not prepared. The chamber itself takes your breath first. It's enormous in a way that architecture shouldn't be, carved from a hollowed moon called Verath's cradle, positioned at the precise gravitational center of the Accord's original 7 founding star systems. The ceiling is open in sections, and through panels of reinforced transparent alloy you can see actual stars, real ones, moving slowly as the moon rotates. During certain hours, when the rotation angle's just right, the light catches the chamber floor, this polished black stone called Veth marble, and it looks like you're standing inside the galaxy itself. I remember thinking, no wonder they built treaties here. You can't be small-minded when the universe is literally visible from the floor. But that's not the moment I'm talking about. The moment comes at the entrance. Every species, every single one, that sends delegates to the Galactic Accord Council does the same thing. Has done the same thing for 400 years, since the Accord was founded after the Silence Wars. Each delegation arrives through the Grand Approach Corridor, which is exactly what it sounds like. A long, cathedral-ceiling hallway lined on both sides with ancient stone carvings depicting every signatory species' founding contribution to galactic peace. And every delegation, every species, carries something. The Drev, massive, 8-limbed arthropods from the heavy-gravity worlds of the Rakul Belt carry their thrall blades. Ceremonial, yes, but real. Edges folded 200 times in gravitite ore. They're strapped across 4 of their limbs at once, and the blades themselves hum at a frequency you feel in your teeth. The Myersi, fluid-form beings who travel in pressurized containment suits of their own design, carry weapons that technically don't exist by any classification the Accord recognizes. They call them resonance anchors. Other species call them the things that ended the Myerkan Civil War in 11 minutes. The Cathari delegation always arrives with their bone singers, priests who are simultaneously honor guards, carrying ceremonial staffs tipped with compressed void matter. The void matter alone could collapse the molecular structure of anything within a 12-meter radius if it were ever unsealed. It never has been. The point isn't that they'd use it. The point is that it's there. I watched species after species file through that corridor on my first assembly day. The Tharan delegation I was accompanying carried resonance shields, personal energy barriers that, when activated, could stop a plasma round at point-blank range. Ambassador Selvori wore 3 of them, layered, nested inside each other like invisible armor. I asked her once before we entered, "Is this all ceremonial, the weapons?" She turned all 4 of her eyes toward me, amber calm but with a flicker of something I didn't quite recognize. "It is tradition," she said. "But tradition exists because something made it necessary." I didn't understand what she meant yet. Then the human delegation arrived. I should explain something about the way the Accord chamber works, because it matters. The Grand Approach Corridor has an entry scanner. Has had one since the founding. A massive archway of interlocked sensor rings that can read biological signatures, energy emissions, material composition, atmospheric displacement, and about 30 other data points that I only understood maybe half of even after 3 years of diplomatic schooling. Every delegation passes through it. Every delegation triggers readings. The readings are logged, cataloged, and made available as public Accord record. Transparency, they call it. Show us what you bring into this chamber, and we will all know the nature of what sits beside us. The Drev's thrall blades register as Class 7 ceremonial weapons. The Myersi's resonance anchors register as Class Unknown. They've been listed as unknown since the first assembly 400 years ago, and apparently no one has ever pushed the issue hard enough to change the designation. The Tharan resonance shields register as Class 4 passive defense arrays. Everything gets flagged. Everything gets logged. The sensor arch has never, in 400 years of Accord assemblies, returned a blank reading for any delegation. Until it didn't. The human delegation that year, I remember this clearly, because I was standing at an angle that gave me a direct sightline to both the corridor and the sensor arch display panel, walked through the arch. All 11 of them, in their dark formal suits with the small blue and white pin of the Terran diplomatic corps on the lapel. And the panel read, "No armaments detected, no defensive arrays detected, no energy-based deterrence detected, biological standard, environmental standard, no threat classification applicable." A blank. For the first time in 400 years, a delegation walked through the grand approach corridor with absolutely nothing. The Drev honor guards stationed beside the arch, 2 of them, massive and still as stone, actually turned their compound eyes toward the panel, then toward the humans, then back toward the panel. I don't think I'd ever seen a Drev look confused before. They're not a species that does confusion visibly, but there it was. One of the senior Tharan aides standing near me made a soft sound. Not language, just sound. The kind you make when something doesn't fit the shape of the world you've built in your head. I leaned toward her. Her name was Vel. She'd been attending these assemblies for 20 years, and I whispered, "Is that normal for humans?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's always been normal for humans. That's exactly what makes it strange." I want to be careful here because I've told this story to other people, other species, other aides, other diplomats, and the reaction is almost always the same. They laugh, or they make the equivalent of a laugh. They assume it's a quirk, a cultural eccentricity. Like how the Cathari never sit with their dorsal spines facing a wall, or how Myrcy delegates always speak with a 7-second delay between statements, because their communication protocols were built for a species that processes in parallel. They assume humans just forgot to bring weapons. Or they assume humans are arrogant, so confident in their position that they don't feel the need for the traditional display. Or they assume humans are naive, young enough as a galactic species that they don't understand the depth of what the corridor tradition means. I believed one of those things once. I'm not sure which one. Probably the arrogance one, if I'm being honest with myself. I was wrong about all of them. It took me 3 years, 6 more assemblies, and one very specific incident in a maintenance corridor on the 4th level of the council chamber to understand what the humans were actually doing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the first day of that assembly, because the atmosphere matters. The feel of that room matters. The Accord chamber seats 4,000 delegates when it's at full capacity, representatives from 97 signatory species, plus observer teams from another 43 non-signatory worlds, still in the consideration period. The seating is arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking platform, not elevated, specifically, because no species should have to look up or down to be heard, and every species section is environmentally adjusted for their biological needs. The Drev section runs at twice standard gravity. The Myrcy section is sealed behind a clear pressure barrier, their liquid forms visible but separated. The Cathari sit in what looks like permanent shadow because their home world circles a dim red dwarf and full-spectrum lighting gives them headaches. The human section is just normal, standard atmosphere, standard lighting, standard temperature, the same settings you'd find in any mid-range hotel on any mid-range colony world. I remember thinking, even their environmental requirements are unremarkable. But then the session started. The Grand Arbiter that year was a Vethkori named Halaz, ancient by any species measure, moving slowly in their magnetic levitation frame, their 4 vocal membranes producing harmonized tones that the translation units converted into language. Halaz had been Grand Arbiter for 60 years, had presided over 47 full assemblies, had personally negotiated the end of the Drev Cathari border dispute that had been simmering for a century. Halaz opened the session in the traditional way, the reading of the accord, the naming of the signatories, and then the first witness call, the part where any delegation may bring before the full assembly a matter of pressing concern to galactic stability. It's usually procedural. Someone raises a resource dispute. Someone else raises a sovereignty question over a newly discovered system. Occasionally, there's a territorial complaint that gets referred to a subcommittee and argued about for 3 years before anyone does anything. That day, the first delegation to rise was the Myersey. And they were not raising a resource dispute. The Myersey delegate, their form pressed close against the interior wall of their containment suit, tendrils of self-luminous fluid trailing in slow arcs, spoke for 11 minutes. I'm condensing this, obviously, but the core of what they said was this. There was a human colony ship, the Utes Vardinel, registered out of the Terran colony hub at Ia Station, en route to a newly approved settlement zone in the outer reaches of the Cashin Drift, a region of space that had only recently been opened to habitation following the resolution of a disputed sovereignty claim. The Vardinel had gone dark 17 days ago, which by itself might mean anything. Ships go dark, communications systems fail, drives malfunction, it's a big galaxy. Except 3 days before the Vardinel went dark, it had transmitted a routine check-in to Ia Station that included, buried in the standard data package, an anomalous sensor log. The kind of log that gets flagged by automated systems and forwarded up the chain until someone actually looks at it. Someone looked at it. What the Vardinel's sensors had recorded in the outer edge of the Cashin Drift, which was, theoretically, empty space, was a fleet signature. Not a small one. The Myersey delegate paused there, let the translation units finish, let the chamber absorb what had just been said. 43 warships, running without transponders, moving on a heading that, if extended forward, intersected with 7 inhabited systems, 2 Accord transit corridors, and if taken all the way to its logical terminus, the gravitational boundary of the Terran home system. 43 warships, transponder dark. The chamber went very, very quiet. I want you to understand what 43 transponder dark warships means in the context of Accord politics, because the weight of it isn't immediately obvious if you haven't lived in diplomatic space. The Galactic Accord was built on one foundational principle above all others: presence must be declared. You announce your ships, you register your movements, you log your armaments. You do this not because anyone trusts anyone else completely, they don't, they never have, but because the act of declaring is itself the deterrent. If everyone knows what everyone else has, the cost of aggression becomes calculable. And when cost is calculable, most species choose not to pay it. Transponder dark ships are the opposite of that principle. They're the thing that makes the system break down. They're 43 unknowns in a galaxy that has spent 400 years trying to make the unknown knowable. And the Vardinel had found them. And then the Vardinel had gone dark. The chamber had been quiet for maybe 10 seconds when the Drev contingent, all 16 of them, moving with that eerie synchronized slowness that large arthropods achieve when they're deeply unsettled, turned their compound eyes toward the human section. Then the Cathari did. Then the half-dozen species I didn't even have names for yet, the newer signatories from the outer arms. Everyone looked at the humans. The human delegation sat exactly as they had been sitting. No visible reaction. The lead delegate, a woman named Priya Anandosai, I looked her up later, she'd been in Terran diplomacy for 30 years, had her hands folded on the table in front of her. She was watching the Myersey delegate finish their statement. Her expression was composed, alert, but composed. She didn't look afraid. That, I think, was the first time I noticed something true about the humans. Not the lack of weapons in the entrance corridor. Something deeper, something in the quality of her stillness. Most species, when presented with an existential threat, show it, not always the same way. Drev go rigid. Cathari's throat membranes inflate. Tharin's bioluminescence spikes. The fear response is biological, universal across every species we know of. Fear produces a visible signal because fear evolved as communication. I am afraid. This situation is dangerous, be aware. Priya Anandosai's bioluminescence, which is to say her face, showed nothing that read as fear. It read as I already knew. After the session broke for the first environmental rotation, a 2-hour period where delegations return to their quarters, and the chamber systems recalibrate for the next atmospheric configuration, I ended up, somewhat by accident, in the 4th-level observation lounge. It wasn't an accident, actually. Ambassador Selvori had sent me specifically to observe who was there, who was talking to whom, and what the general temperature of informal diplomacy looked like following the Myerses announcement. This is a significant portion of what junior aides actually do at these assemblies. Watch, catalog, report back. The lounge was busy, unusually busy. Small clusters of delegates and aides from a dozen species, all doing the galactic equivalent of what humans apparently call comparing notes, sharing information, feeling out positions, trying to construct a picture of something no one fully understood yet. The humans were there too. Not all of them. 3 of the 11-person delegation. Priya Anandosai, a tall man whose translation unit tag identified him as Dr. Kiran Voss, and a younger aide I didn't get a name for, sitting slightly apart with a data tablet, not participating in conversation but watching everything with the kind of quiet attention that I would later learn to recognize as a specifically human skill. The Drev representative who approached them first was named Garathul, a junior council member, not part of the main delegation, the kind of diplomatic figure who operates in the informal spaces precisely because they have enough rank to get information but not enough seniority to be constrained by official position. Garathul moved to within comfortable Drev speaking distance, which is farther than most species prefer, because Drev acoustic resonance carries differently, and addressed Priya in the Accord's standard diplomatic language. I was positioned near enough to hear it. Garathul said, "Your vessel found the fleet." Not a question. Priya looked at them, steady, that same quality of composed alertness. "Yes," she said. "And your vessel is now silent," Garathul said. "Yes. You are not concerned that we would wonder about that silence." There was a beat, not a long one, the kind of pause that isn't hesitation, it's consideration. There's a difference, and I was starting to learn how to read it. "We expected you to wonder," Priya said. "That's why we didn't attempt to explain it." Garathul's limbs shifted, a Drev expression I'd been taught to read as something between fascination and unease. "You expected us to wonder, and you said nothing." "We said nothing in the chamber, yes." "Why?" And here's the part that I've thought about more times than I can count. The part that changed the shape of how I understood the humans, or began to. Priya Anandosai looked at Garathul with an expression that I can only describe badly, because there isn't a word for it in the Accord's standard language, and I'm not sure there's one in Tharan either, as patient precision. Like someone who has been holding a card for a very long time and is only now deciding whether this is the right moment to show it. She said, because the chamber is not where that conversation should happen. It took me another day to understand what she meant. On the second day of the assembly, the Transponder Dark Fleet became the only thing anyone was talking about. Officially, the Accord had opened a priority investigation, a formal process that involves the deployment of Accord survey vessels, the activation of border monitoring arrays, and the convening of a security subcommittee that meets in closed session. I was not part of the closed session. Junior aides rarely are. But I was present in the antechamber outside it, along with approximately 40 other aides and attachés from various delegations, all of us engaged in the careful, unacknowledged ritual of listening to whatever managed to carry through the walls or leak through the ventilation in any way that could be diplomatically ignored. Here's what I put together from those fragments, from the formal session transcripts that became available 12 hours later, and from 3 separate conversations I had with people who were inside the room. The security subcommittee convened with representatives from 14 of the largest Accord member species. The Tharan were there. The Drev were there. The Cathari, the Myersi, the Vethkori, all the heavy presences. The humans were there. The question on the floor was, who does that fleet belong to? The answer, which came slowly and with great discomfort from several different directions, was, no one we recognize. Not a rogue Drev faction, not a splinter Cathari movement, not the several smaller species who'd been nursing various grievances against the Accord for decades. Not any of the 6 non-signatory species who'd been tracked as potential threat actors. Not anything in the threat matrices that 47 different intelligence services across the Accord's member worlds had been maintaining. Unknown ships, unknown affiliation, unknown origin. Moving toward the core systems. A Drev military analyst, someone whose name I never got, reportedly said at that point in the discussion. Then we have no choice. We must commit defensive assets to the cache and drift transit corridor immediately. There was, apparently, a brief silence after that. And then the human representative said, "We already have." Let me stop here for a moment and explain something, because the weight of that statement, "we already have," only makes sense if you understand the geography of the situation. The cache and drift is not close to Terran space in any direction that matters. It's 7 transit jumps from the nearest Terran colony, 14 from Earth itself. Moving a meaningful naval force to that region isn't something you decide to do and then do. It takes weeks of preparation, logistics coordination, transit authorization from the Accord's navigational authority, supply chain planning. You don't do it in response to an incident that happened 17 days ago. You certainly don't do it in response to an incident that you only officially became aware of 11 days ago, when the automated flag on the sensor log made its way up the chain. You do it before, in advance, which means the humans had begun moving assets to the cache and drift before the Vardinel even transmitted its sensor log. Which means they'd known something was in that region of space before any of this became official. Which means the Vardinel hadn't accidentally found an unknown fleet. The Vardinel had been looking. I heard this sitting in the antechamber, filtering it through fragments and inference, and a conversation with a Cathari aide named Thursek who'd been inside the room and was badly shaken in a way that Cathari don't usually show. Thursek's throat membranes were still slightly inflated 20 minutes after she'd stepped outside. I asked her what had happened. She thought about it for a moment, then she said, "They were already there. Before we knew to ask the question, they were already there." I didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but I was starting to feel the shape of it. The third day of the assembly brought the first real conflict. Not with the unknown fleet, nothing that dramatic, not yet. The conflict was inside the chamber, between species, between different ways of understanding what was happening and what should happen next. The Drev position was straightforward. The Accord should formally mobilize a joint defense force, assign it to the cache and drift corridor, and authorize it to engage any transponderdark vessel with force if identification challenges were not met. This was the Drev way of thinking about security, direct, proportional, escalatory when necessary. The Meyersi position was more complicated, as Meyersi positions tend to be. They wanted to know what the humans knew. They wanted that information formally entered into the Accord record. They wanted a full intelligence disclosure before any military action. The Cathari were caught between the two positions, as Cathari often are, because their theology requires a period of spiritual discernment before any action that involves the potential taking of life. And they were trying to figure out how to reconcile that with the fact that transponderdark warships don't generally wait for spiritual discernment. And then there was the moment that I think about more than any other. It happened during an open floor period, a segment of the assembly where any delegate may address the chamber directly without going through the formal speaker queue. It's meant for urgent matters, points of order, things that can't wait. The delegate who stood was from a species called the Velshan, small, fast-moving, from a system near the cache and drift's inner edge. They'd been Accord members for 60 years, quiet members, the kind of species that signs treaties and follows rules and generally stays out of the larger political currents because they're too small to move them. The Velshan delegate, their designation translates roughly as third voice of the outer settlements, stood and addressed the chamber. I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but I've read the official transcript many times. They said, "We would like to know why the humans are here without weapons. We have asked this question before in smaller rooms and quieter conversations, and we have never received an answer that satisfies us. We believe this assembly, given what we now face, deserves an honest answer. We ask the Terran delegation to explain themselves." The chamber went quiet. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recognition. The Velshan had said the thing that everyone else had been circling around for 3 days. I looked at the human section. Priya Anandosai stood up. I'm going to try to tell you what she said as accurately as I can, because I've thought about it for years, and I still think it's one of the most precise pieces of diplomatic communication I've ever heard in that chamber. I've attended 11 assemblies now. I've heard speeches by grand arbiters, declarations by Drev war councils, the strange harmonic oratory of the Vethkori. I've heard things that moved me and things that frightened me and things I didn't understand at all. This was different from all of those. She didn't use formal diplomatic register. She used conversational standard, the way you'd speak to someone you were trying to be honest with. She said, "Our ancestors on our home world discovered, a very long time ago, that the most dangerous thing you can do in a room full of frightened people is draw a weapon. Not because weapons aren't sometimes necessary. They are. But because the moment you draw one in a room full of frightened people, the situation changes. It becomes about the weapon. It becomes about threat and response and escalation and counter-escalation. And the actual problem, the thing that made everyone frightened in the first place, gets further away, not closer." She paused. "We bring no weapons into this chamber, because this chamber is where the actual problems live. And we have found in our history that weapons make problems worse before they make them better. And sometimes, if you're not careful, weapons make the problem permanent." Another pause, shorter this time. "We are not unarmed. You know this. The species in this room with access to intelligence services know approximately what Terran military capacity looks like, and we know that you know, and that is fine. We are not hiding it. We are simply not bringing it here to this place on this floor because this floor is not where that belongs." She looked around the chamber, all 400 and however many delegates. "What belongs here is the conversation. The one we are currently not having, because we are arguing about mobilization timelines and intelligence disclosure protocols, and the fleet in the Cashin drift is moving while we do that." She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a very long time. After that session ended, it broke early, which itself was unusual, a sign that Hallows had read the room and decided that everyone needed space to process. I ended up again in a corridor. Not the observation lounge this time. A maintenance corridor on the 4th level, which I discovered was a useful place to think because no one else used it for anything except actually maintaining things, and the maintenance schedule meant it was empty during session breaks. I sat on a conduit housing, and I thought about what Priya Anandosai had said. And I tried to find the flaw in it. Because I wanted there to be a flaw. I'd spent 4 years studying galactic diplomacy, 3 years specifically studying the intersection of military capacity and diplomatic positioning. I'd read the history of the Accord from before its founding, the Silence Wars, the century of attrition conflict that had reduced 3 entire star systems to uninhabitable rock and convinced the surviving species that something had to change. The lesson I'd been taught from all of that history was, strength is the prerequisite for peace. You must demonstrate capacity before the other party will take you seriously, before they will sit down, before they will negotiate in good faith. A species that appears weak is a species that invites aggression, and a species that invites aggression is a species that eventually loses the ability to build anything else. That was the lesson. That was why every species brought weapons through that corridor. And here was this human diplomat dismantling it, not by arguing with it, but by pointing at something it left out, something I hadn't thought about. The lesson assumed that the problem was the other party. But what if the problem was the room? I went back to the Tharan delegation quarters that evening and found Ambassador Selvori in the secondary briefing room, going through something on her display panel with 2 of the senior aides. Her bioluminescence was steady amber, calm but focused. I knocked on the door frame. She looked up, waited. I said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about my duties?" She made a gesture I'd learned to read as permission and mild amusement. "The humans," I said, "they've been doing this, coming unarmed, since they first joined the Accord. How long is that?" 94 years, she said. They are the youngest signatory. And in 94 years, has anyone ever pointed out that it's strange? She set down what she was reading. Her full attention shifted to me, all 4 eyes, the bioluminescence shifting into a slightly cooler amber that I'd learned to read as paying close attention. "Many times," she said, "in the early years, some species interpreted it as ignorance. They assumed humans didn't understand the tradition. A few quietly informed them of what the corridor scan represented, what it was meant to demonstrate. What did the humans say? They thanked the species who informed them. They said they understood, and then they continued to come unarmed." I sat with that for a moment. Did anyone ever take it as an insult, like they thought themselves above it? Some did, There was a period, maybe 40 years ago, when the Drev War Council formally requested that the Accord censure the Terran delegation for failing to honor the tradition. The Grand Arbiter at the time declined, on the grounds that the tradition is cultural, not codified. She paused. The Drev were not pleased, but they also did not push further. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. The amber deepened slightly, the color she showed when she was choosing words carefully. Because by that point, the Terrans had already done the thing they did today. Several times, in smaller chambers, they had been present for situations where an answer was needed before the question was asked, where a solution existed before the problem was declared. The Drev War Council is not a collection of fools. They recognized what they were looking at. She picked up her reading again. The conversation was ending. The weapons in the corridor, she said, almost to herself, tell the room what you carry. The humans have found a different way to tell the room what they carry. On the fourth day, the situation in the Kashan drift changed. The Accord survey vessels that had been dispatched following the Myersey's initial disclosure arrived at the region where the Vardinel had detected the Transponderdark fleet. They found the fleet, all 43 ships. And they found something else. The fleet was stopped. Not drifting, stopped, in a way that takes active effort in space, maintaining position against the natural gravitational currents of the region. Holding formation. 43 ships, Transponderdark, weapons ready by the energy signatures, stopped. The survey vessels sent identification challenges. Standard Accord protocol, repeated 3 times in all 6 of the Accord's recognized communication formats. No response. The survey vessels then transmitted the situation to the Accord relay network, which forwarded it to the Assembly. The Security Subcommittee convened again, closed session, while the full Assembly waited in the chamber in a kind of collective held breath that I've never experienced before or since. 4,000 delegates from 97 species, sitting in a hollowed moon, watching a ceiling full of stars, waiting to find out what was stopped in the dark at the edge of the Kashan drift. The closed session lasted 4 hours. When it ended and the delegates returned to the chamber, the thing they came back with was this. The Accord survey vessels had made one more attempt at communication before the subcommittee meeting. Not a formal challenge, an informal broadcast, low frequency, on a band that the Accord uses for distress and emergency signals rather than military or diplomatic exchange. They'd transmitted in 40 different languages, every registered language in the Accord's database. And then, at the suggestion of the one person in the survey team who happened to have thought of it, they'd transmitted in 67 more, pre-Accord languages, languages from before the signatory species had space travel, ancient languages, dead languages. In one of them, a language called Veln, spoken by a species called the Velnar who had been extinct for 300 years, wiped out in the early Silence Wars before the Accord was ever founded. One of the stopped ships had responded. It was a distress signal. The 43 Transponderdark warships were not an invasion fleet. They were refugees. I know how that sounds. 43 warships don't look like refugees. But stay with me, because the detail that came next is the one that stitches the whole picture together. The Velnar had not been wiped out in the Silence Wars. A portion of them, the ones who'd had ships when the killing started, had run. Had jumped into deep space without coordinates or a plan. Had been running, in a very real sense, for 300 years, surviving on ship-grown food and generation ship population mechanics, and a technology base that started where the Accord was in the early Silence War period and evolved from there in complete isolation. 300 years of isolation. 300 years of running. And they'd come back, finally, because their ships were failing. Because they had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd been born in space and never known anything else. Because 300 years of running is enough. Because someone in their fleet had apparently started picking up Accord signals and spent 20 years learning the languages, and eventually convinced the Fleet Council that the war that had driven them out might, just possibly, be over. They'd come back without transponders, because their transponders were the old Velnar design, pre-Accord, unrecognized by modern systems. They'd run dark not to be threatening, but because their systems weren't compatible with anything the Accord recognized. 43 warships full of people who'd spent 3 centuries afraid. That was what was stopped in the Kashan drift. And the Vardinel had found them. And the Vardinel had gone dark not because something had happened to it, but because the moment its crew had realized what they were looking at, not a threat, not a fleet, but 300 years of fear made steel, they'd shut down their own systems to avoid looking threatening to people who had every historical reason to run from anything that looked like a warship. The Vardinel's crew had made that decision themselves. No orders, no protocol, they just understood. In the chamber, after all of that had been explained, the silence was different. I've described silences in that room before. This was a new one, not shock, not tension, not the held breath of waiting. This was the silence of an entire chamber of 4,000 beings from 97 species simultaneously recalibrating. The Drev, who had come into this assembly ready to mobilize a strike force, were still. The Myersi were still. The Cathari's throat membranes, which I'd been watching like a barometer all week, were fully relaxed for the first time since the second day. The Grand Arbiter Halas let the silence stand for almost 2 full minutes. Then, slowly, they raised one of their delicate limbs and spoke. They said, "We appear to have encountered a situation for which our traditions did not prepare us." They paused. I would ask the Terran delegation whether they have a recommendation. Priya Anandosai stood again. She said, "Yes, send the colony ship back." Halas waited, others waited. She said the Vardinel is a colony ship. That's what it was built for. It has environmental systems, food production, medical facilities. Send it back to the Velnar fleet with an Accord observer team and a representative from every signatory species who wants to send one. Not warships, not survey vessels, a colony ship. Let the Velnar fleet see that the first thing that comes toward them is something built for living, not for fighting. Silence again. Then Halas said, "And what of the defense question?" The Security Subcommittee has authorized the deployment of Accord defensive assets to the corridor. The recommendation is all ready. Cancel it, Priya said, cleanly, simply, or redirect the assets to escort duty protecting the approach, not guarding against it. They're afraid. 43 warships worth of afraid. If they see defense formations moving toward them, they'll run and we won't find them again. And 300 more years of running will be our responsibility. Another silence, longer. Then something happened that I had genuinely never seen before in 4 years of attending these assemblies. The Drev delegation, all 16 of them, moving with that synchronized slowness, inclined their primary appendages. It's not a bow, Drev don't bow. But it's the closest thing they have to it. An acknowledgement in their physical language of something that has demonstrated its nature clearly. They inclined toward the human section. I spent a long time after that assembly trying to understand what I'd witnessed. Not the diplomacy of it, the diplomacy was, in retrospect, almost straightforward. The mechanics were clear, I mean something deeper. I'd spent 4 years being taught that the fundamental currency of galactic relations is demonstrated power. That species earn their place at the table by making clear what they're capable of. That the traditions of the corridor, the weapons through the archway, the class ratings on the scanner display, all of it serves a single function. We know what you have, you know what we have, and now we can talk. What the humans had done, over 94 years of attending this assembly, was find a different currency. Not ignorance of power, not arrogance about their own. They were not pretending to be weak. They were not pretending the weapons didn't exist. They had assets positioned in the Kashin drift before anyone else knew there was a problem there. They had a colony ship crew that, in the moment of contact with 300 years of trauma and fear, had made exactly the right call without being told to. The currency they were trading in wasn't power. It was judgment. And judgment, it turns out, doesn't register on a scanner. I've told this story to new aides when I train them. I've told it at the beginning of their first assembly, before they see the corridor for the first time. Before they see the readings on the sensor panel as species after species walks through, and the display lights up with weapon classifications and energy arrays and defense systems. I tell them, watch for the blank. They always ask, why do the humans come unarmed? And I always say the same thing. They don't. Because by the time Priya Anandosai stood up in that chamber and said we are not unarmed, it was already too late for anyone to argue with her. The Velnar fleet was in the Kashin drift. The Vardinel was dark. The assets were positioned. The colony ship recommendation was already obviously correct to everyone in the room. And the reason it was obviously correct was that a human had said it. And everyone in the room had spent 3 days watching humans operate in a crisis and had drawn their own conclusions. You can walk through a scanner. You can carry weapons through a scanner. You can fill the display with readings and classifications. But you cannot scan for what happens when the real problem arrives, and you need someone to know what to do. There's an epilogue to this story, and I want to tell it because it's the part that makes the rest of it make sense in a way that nothing else quite does. 8 months after that assembly, the Vardinel returned to the Cashin Drift with an Accord observer team and representatives from 41 signatory species. The Terran Foreign Ministry had somehow, in 8 months, found 3 linguists who could speak Veln, or at least speak enough of it to hold a basic conversation. They'd also put together a cultural packet, everything the Accord had on the Velnar from before the Silence Wars. Artwork, music, historical records. Things the Velnar fleet had been carrying in fragmentary copies for 3 centuries. The first meeting lasted 9 hours. The second lasted 3 days. At the end of the third meeting, the Velnar Fleet Council voted to accept Accord observer status, the preliminary step before full membership consideration. It's a process that typically takes 20 years. The Velnar fleet asked to anchor in a region near the Terran colony hub at Eos Station while the process proceeded. Not deep space, not isolated, near something. Near someone. The humans said yes. And the Velnar fleet, 43 warships, 300 years of running, a species that had been dead to the galaxy and wasn't, came to rest, finally, in the light of someone else's star. With weapons they hadn't thought to check and a colony ship crew who'd known, without being told, that silence was more important than protocol. I'm an ambassador now. I've been attending these assemblies for 18 years. I've watched a lot of things change in the Accord, new members, new conflicts, new crises, new resolutions. The galaxy keeps moving. It always does. But every time I walk through that corridor on the first day of a new assembly, I do the same thing. I watch the scanner panel. I watch the Drev's Thrallblades register Class 7. I watch the Myrces resonance anchors come up unknown. I watch whatever new species is here for the first time bring their equivalent of what every species brings, the thing that says we have this, we are capable of this, consider us accordingly. And then I watch the human delegation walk through. And the panel goes blank. And every time, without fail, I see the same thing happen around me. New delegates, young ones, first-timers, people who haven't been here before turn to look at the humans with that expression. The one that says, did they forget? Are they naive? Are they arrogant? What does this mean? And every time I almost say something. I almost explain it. But then I think about what Priya Anandosai said, and about what Ambassador Selvori said, and about the silence of the Vardinel in the dark of the Cashin Drift, and about a fleet of people who'd been running for 300 years and found, finally, someone who knew how to stand still. And I let them wonder. Because the wondering is the beginning of the understanding. And the understanding, when it comes, and it always comes, eventually, for everyone who spends enough time in a room with humans, changes something that doesn't go back to the way it was before. The galaxy knows why the humans come unarmed. The galaxy just has to remember how to ask the question the right way. And then, and only then, does the answer arrive. Like it always has, like it always will. Quiet, patient, already there before you knew to look. End of Part 1, The Unarmed Ones. Part 2, What the Sensors Don't Catch. I didn't plan to write more of this. I told that story, the Vardinel, the Velnar fleet, the Grand Assembly, Priya Anandosai's speech in the chamber, and I thought it was complete. A full accounting, the shape of a thing with a beginning and an end. But stories about humans, I've learned, don't really end. They open into other stories, like corridors that seem to close but actually just turn. This is the second corridor. My name, my full designation in the Tharan form, is something that human mouths can't easily pronounce, so the humans I've worked with over the years call me Vel, the shortened version of my earliest title. I don't mind. There's something in the compression of it that suits the way humans communicate. Direct, efficient, stripped of ceremony without being stripped of meaning. I'm an ambassador now for the Tharan Collective, as I said. I've been doing this for a long time. What I haven't told you is what happened after the Velnar situation, after that first assembly. What happened in the years between then and now that filled in the picture, not all at once. The way revelations happen in stories, but slowly, the way understanding actually arrives. Piece by piece, in small rooms, in overheard conversations, in moments that don't seem significant until they do. The second corridor begins with a being named Dr. Kieran Voss. Kieran Voss was the tall man in the observation lounge on the first day of that assembly. The one from the Terran delegation who I'd noticed but hadn't spoken to. He was there in a capacity I hadn't understood at the time. Not a diplomat, not a military attaché, not any of the roles I was trained to identify. His formal title, according to the delegation roster, was Cultural Integration Specialist. I had no idea what that meant. 3 months after that assembly, while I was back in the Tharan embassy on a mid-range colony station called Vethpira, think of a city that someone built inside a very large hollowed-out asteroid, and you have the basic idea. I received a message through the Accord diplomatic network. Not official, personal channel, flagged as non-urgent. It was from Kieran Voss. He asked if I was available for a conversation. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity. We met via relay projection, because the light delay between his location and mine made real-time communication impractical in the diplomatic equivalent of a video call. He appeared about 2/3 life-size in my projection field, sitting in what I recognized from his background as a standard Terran colony office. Tidy, functional. One wall covered in what I would later learn to identify as bookshelves, physical books, paper the old kind. He said hello, asked how I was, complimented the Tharan Collective's position during the assembly in a way that wasn't flattery. It was specific, about a particular statement Ambassador Selvori had made during the closed session deliberations, which meant he'd read the transcript carefully. I told him what he already seemed to know, that I was well, that the assembly had been productive, that the Tharan Collective was pleased with the outcome. Then he said, I noticed you in the observation lounge. On the first day, you were watching people. I admitted that I had been. It's my job. What were you watching for? Temperature, I told him. Emotional temperature. How frightened people were, what direction their fear was pointing. He nodded, something shifted in his expression, something I didn't have language for yet, though I was starting to accumulate what I thought of as a personal dictionary for human faces. That's what I do too, he said, more or less. What exactly is a cultural integration specialist? He smiled at that. It's a human expression I was still learning to read precisely. There are so many kinds. This one seemed to contain both amusement and a kind of self-deprecation. Officially, he said, I assess how well human diplomatic presence integrates with the cultural and emotional frameworks of other species. I look for friction points, miscommunications that are going to become problems before they become obvious. Patterns in how non-human species receive human behavior, and whether that reception is accurate to our intent. And unofficially, I try to understand why people are afraid. We talked for a long time that day, and many days after over the next several months. Not always about anything specific, sometimes just observations, things we'd each noticed, comparisons between species and how they process the same events differently. He was, I came to realize, remarkably good at it. Not in a performative way. Not the way some diplomats are good at seeming to understand you while actually cataloging you for tactical purposes. He was good at it the way a person is good at a thing they've been doing so long it's become part of how they see. During one of those conversations, maybe the 5th or 6th, I've lost the exact count, I asked him about the weapons. The corridor, the blank sensor reading. Because I'd been thinking about it since the assembly. I'd constructed what I thought was a reasonable explanation, based on what Priya had said in the chamber and what Ambassador Selvori had told me afterward. But something still felt incomplete. He listened to my explanation, the whole thing. When I was done, he said, that's not wrong, but it's missing a piece. What piece? He was quiet for a moment. I'd learned by then that his pauses were not the same as hesitation. He was constructing something, finding the right form for it. He said, have you ever heard of the concept of a credible commitment problem? I said I wasn't sure. In game theory, a field of mathematics that also turns out to be a field of diplomacy, a credible commitment problem is when you want to signal something to another party. But the signal you're sending could equally be sent by someone who doesn't actually have the thing they're signaling. So the signal loses its value. He paused. If I show up to a negotiation with a weapon, I'm signaling that I have power. But so does every other party in the room. The weapon becomes expected. Baseline. The room normalizes around it. The signal that was supposed to say something specific, I have power, I am a serious party, just becomes noise. And if you don't bring the weapon, then you're saying something different, something that can't be faked by just bringing a weapon. I thought about that. But you're not saying something specific, I said. You're just absent. The scanner reads blank. How is a blank a signal? And here is where he said the thing that completed the picture for me, or started to. He said, the blank is only a signal if you fill it with something else, and that something else has to arrive before the blank can be understood. He leaned forward slightly in his projection. That specific kind of focus that I'd come to recognize as him about to say something he'd thought about for a long time. We've been doing this for 94 years. 94 years of blank scanner readings. And every assembly, every session, every closed-room subcommittee, every time there's a real problem, a real crisis, something with no obvious answer, what fills the blank is what we do. How we behave, what we know, what we've already put in place before the question was asked. He sat back. The scanner reads blank because we already spent the assets on something that doesn't show up on a scanner. The scanner can't read preparation. It can't read judgment. It can't read the decision that a colony ship crew makes in the dark when there's no protocol telling them what to do. He looked at me through the projection. Over 94 years, the blank has been filled with enough real behavior that it means something. The species in that chamber have seen what fills the blank. So when they see the blank now, they don't see nothing. They see everything the blank has come to represent. He paused once more. That's what a credible commitment is. Not the weapon, not the display, what you do when the display isn't enough. I've been collecting moments since that conversation, filling in the picture, assembling a kind of personal record of what it actually looks like, not in the high-drama moments of an assembly crisis, but in the smaller, quieter instances that don't make it into transcripts or official records. Here are some of them. Vethpira Station, 2 years after the assembly. A riot small one. A collision of Drev migrant workers and Cathari religious pilgrims over access to a transit platform that both groups needed at the same time, complicated by a Cathari holy day that the station's scheduling system hadn't accounted for. These things happen on multi-species stations. The intersection of calendars and biology and history and scarcity produces conflicts that no one plans for but that happen anyway reliably with the inevitability of weather. The station's security team, a mix of accord-contracted species, arrived with their standard deployment. Shock barriers, containment fields, the things you use to separate people who are rapidly becoming unable to be near each other. The human member of the station's administrative team, a woman named Cass Oleander, who ran the environmental systems and was therefore not supposed to be involved in security situations at all, walked into the space between the two groups. No equipment, no barrier, nothing. She put herself physically between the two groups and she started talking, not to both groups at once. First to the Drev workers in something approaching Drev resonant language, badly pronounced but comprehensible about the transit delay. The practical, specific problem. How long, which platform, what's the alternative? Logistics, details, the concrete stuff. Then she turned and addressed the Cathari pilgrims. Also an imperfect but comprehensible Cathari, apparently. I asked her once, and she said she'd spent 2 years studying it because the station had a significant Cathari population, and she felt like it was her job to be able to communicate. She acknowledged the holy day, named the specific observance correctly, said something that the Cathari pilgrims apparently understood as an expression of respect from someone who had bothered to learn enough to respect. By the time the security team had their containment fields calibrated, there was nothing to contain. I heard about this the next day. I went and found Cass Oleander, and I asked her what she'd been thinking when she walked into the middle of it. She looked slightly surprised by the question. Someone needed to, she said. I was there. But the security team was going to make it worse, she said. Containment fields feel like cages. When people feel caged, they get angrier. And then when you remove the cage, you haven't actually fixed anything, you've just postponed it. She paused. I knew a little of both languages. I knew the specific problem was solvable, I'd already checked, and there was another platform available. So I just said so, in languages they could understand. She said it with the slightly puzzled air of someone explaining a thing that seemed obvious. Does that happen often? I asked, humans just walking into the middle of things. She thought about it. I think we walk toward things that feel solvable, she said, even when they look bad, especially when they look bad. Maybe because we've been in enough rooms that looked bad and turned out to be solvable that we've got a kind of reflex. Like the bad look doesn't stop us the way it might stop something that's never learned to look past it. Accord Transit Station 7, 4 years after the assembly. This one I witnessed directly. A Myrcy containment suit traveling alone through the station, en route to a diplomatic relay post, had a pressure failure. Small as these things go, nothing catastrophic. But the Myrcy inside the suit were experiencing an emergency that was very personal and very frightening. The thing about Myrcy containment suit failures is that they're hard to fix quickly. The pressure systems are Myrcy designed, for obvious reasons, and standard station repair equipment doesn't interface with them. You need either a Myrcy technician or someone who has specifically studied Myrcy containment engineering, which is a narrow specialty, because Myrcy technology is intentionally difficult for non-Myrcy to access. The Accord station had a standard emergency response protocol for this. It involved alerting the nearest Myrcy diplomatic post, requesting a technician, and maintaining a sealed safety perimeter around the affected suit until help arrived. Which sounded fine, except that the nearest Myrcy diplomatic post was 40 minutes away by relay, and the failure was progressing. There was a human on the station, not diplomatic. A technical contractor working on something in the environmental systems. His name badge said Tobias Drum. He heard the alert and came to see what was happening. He looked at the suit. He asked the station staff what the failure classification was. They told him. He made a face that I can only describe as someone rapidly recalculating. Then he asked if he could see the suit's external interface panel. The station staff were uncertain about this. The protocol didn't include private contractors doing anything to a failing containment suit. But the Myrcy inside the suit, whose form was visibly compressed toward one side of the interior, not healthy, made a sound that the translation unit rendered as something between yes and please. Tobias Drum opened a panel that I would not have known existed. He looked at it for a long moment. He asked the station staff if they had 3 specific items, named them in technical terminology that I recognized from engineering training as belonging to pressure system maintenance, and they found them in the emergency kit. He fixed it. Not perfectly. He told the Myrcy and the station staff that it was a temporary repair and that a proper technician needed to assess it within 6 hours. But temporary held. The failure stopped progressing. The Myrcy inside stabilized. I asked Tobias Drum afterward how he'd known what to do. I spent 2 years on a Myrcy joint research platform, he said. Years ago. Maintenance exchange program, picked up some of the basics. Why did you bother? I asked, learning Myrcy containment systems. He looked at me with a slightly puzzled expression, the same expression Cass Oleander had worn. Because it seemed like a useful thing to know, he said. I've accumulated dozens of stories like this, not all of them as dramatic. Some of them are quieter. A human aide who noticed that a DREV delegate was struggling with a translation issue and took an hour to work through it with them personally. A human xenobiologist who published a paper on Cathari seasonal emotional cycles, specifically because the research might help non-Cathari understand why Cathari colleagues behaved differently in certain months, and not knowing this was causing friction in multi-species research teams. Each story alone is small. A woman who stepped between 2 groups with nothing but 2 imperfect languages. A contractor who knew something obscure and useful. A scientist who thought, someone should explain this, let it be me. But the accumulation is the point. The accumulation is what fills the blank. I talked to Kieran Voss again, years after our first conversation. We'd stayed in loose contact, not often, but regularly enough that there was a thread between us. I told him about the stories I'd been collecting. The Cass oleanders and Tobias drums and unnamed xenobiologists. The pattern. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd come to appreciate about him. When I finished, he said, "You know what I think the underlying thing is?" I waited. "I think humans genuinely believe that most problems are solvable," he said. "Not all of them. We're not naive, but most of them. And I think that belief, that specific, sometimes stubborn belief, changes how we approach situations. We walk toward things instead of away because we've decided, somewhere in the cultural DNA, that walking toward is usually the better bet." "Where does that come from?" I asked. "History," he said simply, "and not comfortable history. Humans had a very long, very brutal history of not solving problems, of walking away from them or suppressing them or pretending they didn't exist and then dealing with catastrophic consequences. We've done it many times. We may well do it again." He paused. "But the species, the civilization, learned something from that. Not perfectly, never perfectly. But the lesson is there, woven into the way we approach things. The problem doesn't go away if you don't deal with it. The only direction that actually works is toward it." He looked at me. "That's not wisdom. It's just experience, expensive, painful experience. We paid for it. There's one more thing I want to tell you. The Velnar, in the years after their return, progressed faster through the Accord membership process than any species in the Accord's history. Not because the rules were bent for them. Because they came to every conversation prepared, engaged, deeply invested in understanding the organization they were joining. Because they'd had 300 years of thinking about what they wished existed, and now that it did, they weren't going to waste it. They made a formal request, at their first assembly as observer status members, to deliver a statement to the full chamber. It was unusual. Observers don't typically address the full assembly, but the Grand Arbiter allowed it. The Velnar representative, a third-generation shipborn, someone who had never known a planet, who had been born into the space between stars, stood at the central platform and addressed 4,000 beings from 97 species. They said many things. About what 300 years looked like from inside it. About what it meant to return to a galaxy that had moved on without you. About the disorientation and the grief and the complicated, difficult hope. And then, near the end, they said something about the Vardinel. About the moment when the survey vessels arrived with their identification challenges in all the standard military formats, and the Velnar Fleet Council had been preparing for the worst, had voted to scatter, to run 43 ships in 43 directions, better to be lost again than destroyed together. And then the signal had shifted, to distress frequencies, to ancient languages, to Veln. And someone had heard their own name, the name of their species, their lost species, spoken in their lost language, coming from a ship that had not come to destroy them. And the Velnar representative said, "We ask still who decided to try the old language. We have never learned the name of the person on that survey team who remembered to do it. We would like to know. We would like to thank them." The chamber was very quiet. From the human section, a voice said, "Her name is Lieutenant Faridar Okonkwo. She's currently stationed at Eos Colony. She says it was nothing." The Velnar representative stood very still for a moment. Then they said, "Tell her it was everything.